Welcome to Talking Early Years, a showcase training podcast with Ellen Roberts
and Gemma Carr.
Hello and welcome to today's Talking Early Years podcast. This is our second episode in our Safeguarding Short series. In this episode, we're going to be discussing all about prevent duty. So let's dive in. Ellen, how are you today?
I'm very well, thank you, Gemma. How are you?
Yes, good, thanks. So Ellen, talk me through, what is prevent duty?
So prevent duty, hopefully most of our listeners will have heard of, especially if you're kind of from that education background and early years background. So it's a piece of legislation that came in 2015 as part of the Counter-Terrorism and Security Act. And it's a guidance for everybody in education to follow, not just education, it's health and local authorities, police and criminal justice agencies as well, to aim at reducing the risk of people being drawn into terrorism, and that's through radicalisation, so the grooming process of terrorism, and extremism, so extreme behaviour and unlawful behaviour. And it's just important to kind of note as well that our definition of extremism within that prevent duty was actually updated last year to reflect a bit of a change in the culture within prevent. So traditionally it was brought in response to the rise of radical Islamist terrorism within the UK and the threat, but now it's seen as a much wider thing and quite often looks at different ideologies. So it's defined as extremism is the promotion or advancement of an ideology based on violence, hatred, or intolerance that aims to either negate or destroy the fundamental rights and freedoms of others, undermine, overturn, or replace the UK system of liberal parliamentary democracy or democratic rights, or intentionally create a permissive environment for others to achieve the results in point 1 and 2, enabling the spread of extremism. So really important piece of legislation, especially in our practice and in our everyday practice. And it doesn't just relate to Islamist terrorism, as I say, it's everything from extreme right-wing, extreme left-wing politics, right the way through to any extreme activism within the UK.
Great. So as you said, it's a policy, a legislation within its own right. So the prevent duty came into force in 2015. And it's important for us as early years professionals because we are in an education system, as it were. So we need to know what prevent is and what that legislation means to us. So being able to recognise the signs and symptoms of it and how that can be seen, whether that's in children, whether that's in parents, or whether that's in staff members.
Absolutely, that's it. And it places that legal responsibility on everybody working in education to prevent grassroots terrorism. Part of that strategy is looking at mis and disinformation that could lead to extremist ideology, but noticing those signs and indicators of radicalisation, both, as you say, for yourself and for those around you, to widen your understanding and knowledge about that grooming process and that how that happens. Everybody is susceptible to this part of life, in having extreme views, and how we respond to that is very much an individual responsibility. But in education, we have a specific legal duty. We are duty bound to make sure that we have a strategy to be able to prepare for intervention if needed.
So the legislation behind it is we're looking at the Prevent Duty 2023, Section 26 of the Counter-Terrorism and Security Act of 2025, and then, of course, Keeping Children Safe in Education 2024.
Absolutely. So updated in 2024. So making sure that we're using the most up-to-date piece of legislation there within our safeguarding part of our roles. Prevent duty does fall under the safeguarding section of education. So that Keeping Children Safe in Education 2024 is super important. And part of that is our filtering and monitoring responsibilities. So for example, in safer recruitment, we have a duty as an employer, for example, in education, we have a duty to do searches and soft and hard searches on individuals coming into our education environment, so whether that's social media checks and DBS checks, but we also have a responsibility to implement filtering and monitoring for our PCs and IT systems to ensure that our staff and our learners aren't being exposed at any stage to extremist content.
So, how does it affect us in our general lives then, Ellen?
It affects us in every single possible way. And I think nowadays it is so super important. We talk about in education about having critical thinking skills and being able to detect whether there's dis or misinformation. Fake news is, obviously a phrase that's sort of bandied around quite often in popular culture. And our general everyday life, I think we have all encountered examples of that. And behavior that could constitute extremism includes things like behaviors against a certain group or members of that group. So, particularly looking at negating or destroying their rights to live equally. So, under our rule of law. So, again, relating back to our British values that we spoke about in our last safeguarding short. Oh, those sort of people are looking at behaviours to destroy rights to live equally without the fear or threat of violence, discrimination, or acting in a way that glorifies or excuses violence towards a certain group in order to stop them from using their legally defined rights and freedoms. So, quite often we see that in examples such as protests and counter protests. So protests in the UK are absolutely lawful. We have the right to quiet lawful protests, so where there's not criminal activity happening or criminal damage. But sometimes you see that the other way, and there's a counter group, hurling rocks or Molotov cocktails or whatever it might be, flares at the opposing group to stop their voice being heard. That's absolutely not okay. And you unfortunately do see that on a large scale in the UK. Also in everyday life, we see attempts to undermine or overturn our liberal parliamentary democracy. So again, democratic rights being part of our British values that underpin our prevent duty, including things such as advocating the UK's parliamentary democracy and rights that are not compatible with their ideology. So, for example, seeking to challenge or overthrow our political systems, using threatening language or inciting violence towards certain citizens, subverting the way the public or state institutions exercise their powers, for example, by things like stopping the police from exercising their duties or furthering political or ideological goals by misusing powers, so things like coercion or blackmail of certain people, but also things like using extremism or certain political views to direct a certain part of democracy. So, for example, paying people to vote a certain way that is illegal and that's extremist behaviour, or threatening people for voting a certain way as well. That's something that's not legal in this country. We do see it in other countries abroad, but absolutely not legal in this country. Have you got any examples, Gemma, of where you've seen it affect us in day-to-day life?
So for me, it's one of the questions I was going to ask you, Ellen, was you sort of we've spoken about sort of potentially different religions and differing thoughts on religions and who may well be right or wrong if that's the case, and those extremist views. But just to be clear, it's not just relating to religion, is it?
Absolutely not. So it could be a whole range of different things. So where in the UK we have the right to our freedom of views and freedom of speech, but, and there's a big but, and I think that's certainly something that within the current political arena at the moment, especially with the influence from the US, that is something that is incredibly important to remember. Donald Trump, Elon Musk are not giving us, especially in the UK, but not in the US either, they are not giving us freedom to say whatever we want. In the UK, where we live, we have our own set of values, and one of those is to live with mutual respect amongst our peers, amongst people that we live with. So whether that is a religious thing or whether it's your culture, skin color, gender, and whether that's gender at birth or gender alignment, it doesn't matter. We are protected under law that you cannot discriminate against people for certain characteristics. It could even be things like dietary or lifestyle choices. So
Yes.
veganism, for example, we see both sides actually. I see extreme veganist protests, but I
Yeah.
also see extreme the other way, where people are sending vegan organizations, pig's blood and these awful things. That's absolutely horrendous
No.
behavior. So you see it on both sides. Whether there's a particularly strong view, that tends to, for whatever reason, sometimes go to the extreme. And the extreme here we're talking about is where it delves into illegal activity.
Yeah. It's that the activity of, isn't it?
Absolutely. If you want to hold these views, that's completely up to you. That is your right. However, you mustn't break the law by doing that. And that includes inciting hatred in other people as well.
So in early years, this is something that we should be kind of keeping an eye out for, seeing, and kind of just being aware of what this could look like. So it could be something that potentially children are reenacting, maybe within role play, or it could be something, for example, during arts and crafts, they could be, doing a picture and they are drawing certain symbols within their play, or it could just be sort of the way they're talking to other peers, whether that's to like you said, a different race, a different gender, anything it could be, is that kind of extreme language that the children could be using, and questioning where that could come from.
Absolutely, that's it. And it is having those open conversations of, so why do you think that? Where has that come from? What is fueling your view on that? Is there a particular resource that you're using? And it's important for us as practitioners, both in early years and in adult education, to critically evaluate where we're seeing things. Where is this coming from? Do I trust this as a source? I'm about to base my opinion on something. Is this bias that's coming towards me? Is this misinformation or disinformation or deliberate fake news that's coming towards me to shape my particular view? As I say, you are entitled to whatever opinion you like, as long as you don't try to use that to then harm others for any reason, either to try to persuade them to come round to your point of view, for one, but also, just because you don't like that person because of your view. That is not okay. And as you rightly say, in early years, there's so many signs and indicators, and it's part of our duty in our wider community to look out for those indicators as well and try to intervene. So what happens then, Gemma, in an early year setting? So if you had a child or a colleague equally that you notice there were some signs and indicators of potential radicalisation there.
So the giveaway here is we're talking about safeguarding shorts. This is one of our safeguarding shorts, so it is your same safeguarding route. So exactly the same if you had a concern that the child was being abused. If you had these concerns, you would go to your DSL, designated safeguarding lead. If the concern was about them, you've got your deputy as well, so you could always reach out to your deputy, or you've got MASH and LADO that you can go straight to as well with any concerns regarding that.
Absolutely. And it is really important to sort of highlight as well what happens next in a referral as well. So nowadays, if it's something completely extreme, you're traveling on a train and you see somebody acting very suspiciously, they have potentially a bag or a package that they're leaving unattended, in that very serious situation, incredibly unlikely, but we know dial 999. On a more practical basis, on an everyday life, it's probably not at that stage. So it gets referred to our MASH hub to then have a chat. And there's actually an escalation route that they follow. There's a particular framework that they follow to assess the risk of that person. Potentially, if there is a significant risk, especially in teenagers and adults, that it could be going down a certain pathway and leading into that extremist ideology or actions, so into perhaps terrorism, they may then go down something called the channel panel, which is a group of organisations such as the police, it could even be healthcare services, to then look at intervening in that person's life and trying to prevent that from going any further. So I always think when making referrals, it's important to know what could happen next, so then you know what's going to happen with that person, and have that assurance that your referral is going to make a positive impact and a difference.
Definitely. And obviously we always talk about sort of if you see it in children, but also seeing it within your fellow staff, you know, those are signs and symptoms you may well see in fellow staff as well, and kind of a way that they could be projecting that onto the children within the play or things like that. So again, it's not just the children we should be looking out for, it's the adults around us as well.
Absolutely, friends and family too. And not to sound, you know, too flippant about it sometimes, but sometimes people don't recognize what might constitute a concern as well, because they just think, oh, you know, that's just such and such, he just, you know, hates immigrants, or, you know, has something against asylum seekers, and you kind of brush that off. And it's that kind of willingness to accept certain behaviors, especially in certain cultures or age ranges. But we see it so often in things where we have almost an entitlement of how we expect to be treated and expect our lives to be. And sometimes again that spills over where people just don't realize, people with extremist views aren't going to come up to you and just say, I'm an extremist, you know, I need some help. In some cases people are very aware and know that they need some help, but in most cases people don't really know that they are actually an extremist in themselves. Things like, look at after the Stockport attack, tragically last year, the riots that went on, a lot of people there wouldn't have considered themselves extremism operatives, you know, and people that have been radicalized into a certain way of thinking. But their behavior in the protests, the minority, I must say, of people, let's, you know, remember this, was unlawful, and it was absolutely not acceptable in the UK, and it was extremist, and they have been radicalized to think like that and behave like that and go to those marches. But as I say, you wouldn't necessarily sit with them and think, oh, you know, my next door neighbour's gone to that, oh, he must be a terrorist. You wouldn't go there in your head. But the process leading up is exactly the same. So again, it's having that kind of wider context. So we're not just talking all about, you know, people making bombs in their bedroom kind of thing. Yes, that's, you know, part of it, of course. But there's a very extreme part. There is much more everyday application that we see in the world of education.
Most definitely. Thank you so much for tuning in today. We'd love to hear your thoughts on the topics we've covered and answer any of the questions you might have about what we've discussed. So your input really helps shape our conversations.
Don't forget to like, share and follow this podcast to stay updated. And as always, let's keep the conversation going about early years. Until next time, take care and keep making a difference.